August 17th, 1943, 6:14 a.m., somewhere over the English Channel. 60 bombers are on fire. Not metaphorically, not heavily damaged. On fire. Engines screaming, wings shredding, men falling from 27,000 feet with no parachutes. The sky over Schweinfurt, Germany is turning black with smoke and burning aluminum, and every single one of those aircraft belongs to the United States Army Air Forces. In the next 4 hours, the 8th Air Force will lose 60 B-17 Flying Fortresses, 600 American airmen killed or captured, and whatever remained of its confidence that daylight strategic bombing could actually work. The loss rate is approaching 20%. Do the math. At that rate, an American bomber crew has less than a 1 in 3 chance of surviving their required 25-mission combat tour. These men are not dying in battle. They are being systematically slaughtered by a German air defense machine so efficient, so ruthless, so perfectly designed to destroy American bombers that senior officers in London are quietly whispering the unthinkable: maybe we cannot win this air war. If this kind of deep-dive military history is what you live for, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join our community. We uncover the stories that textbooks skip, the weapons that changed everything, and the ordinary men who did the impossible. You won't want to miss what's coming. But here is what the Germans did not know. On that same morning at a field outside London, a 26-year-old mechanic from Burbank, California, named Thomas Garrett, is wiping hydraulic fluid off his hands and staring at the strangest aircraft he has ever seen in his life. It has 2 engines, 2 tail booms, a cockpit pod hanging between them like a gondola on a cable car. Every other pilot on the base thinks it looks like a science experiment that escaped the laboratory. Garrett thinks it looks like the future. He is right. And what happens next will not just change the outcome of individual dogfights, it will shatter the entire philosophical foundation of German air superiority, humiliate the most experienced fighter pilots in the world, and prove that one radical idea, dismissed as insane by nearly every expert who heard it, could alter the trajectory of a world war. The numbers at the end of this story are almost impossible to believe. Over 1,800 German aircraft destroyed. Bomber loss rates dropping from 20% to below 5%. An American pilot using this machine to shoot down 40 enemy aircraft and become the deadliest ace in American history. And a German ace with 174 combat missions, a man who had never lost an engagement in his life, diving at full speed toward an American fighter, only to watch physics itself stop working. But to understand why that moment was so devastating, you first need to understand the world those German pilots lived in. You need to understand why they were so certain, why their confidence was not arrogance, but cold, hard combat-proven fact. And you need to understand why that certainty made what came next so psychologically catastrophic. By 1941, the Luftwaffe had achieved something no air force in history had managed before. It had won. Not just individual battles, not just temporary air superiority over a single front. It had systematically destroyed the air forces of Poland, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Yugoslavia, and Greece. It had fought the Royal Air Force to a strategic standstill over Britain. It had torn through Soviet air power on the Eastern Front with such ferocity that German pilots were running out of space on their killboards. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the instrument of this destruction. The Gustav variant, the G-series entering service in 1942, was a masterpiece of incremental refinement. Its Daimler-Benz DB605 engine produced 1,475 horsepower. Climb rate at sea level nearly 3,000 feet per minute. Maximum speed 387 miles per hour. And its pilots, men like Franz Stigler, Hans-Joachim Marseille, Erich Hartmann, had thousands of combined combat hours and a tactical doctrine so refined it was practically a science. The doctrine was simple. Altitude equals energy. Energy equals options. Get above your enemy. Dive to attack. Use your speed advantage to make a single devastating pass. Extend away, before he can respond. Climb back to altitude. Repeat until he is dead or running. Every variation of air combat in the European theater in the first 4 years of the war confirmed this doctrine. American aircraft, when they finally appeared, only reinforced German confidence. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, decent enough below 15,000 feet, helpless above it. The Bell P-39. Airacobra, an experimental rear-engine design with vicious spin characteristics that killed American pilots faster than enemy fire. Soviet pilots receiving these aircraft through Lend-Lease quickly learned to stay below medium altitude or die. The Americans German intelligence concluded had numbers. They did not have sophistication. This was not propaganda. This was the lived, blood-soaked experience of men who had been fighting and winning for 4 straight years. And then they met Thomas Garrett's airplane. Garrett grew up in Burbank, California, 2 miles from the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation factory. His father worked there. His uncle worked there. By age 14, Garrett could identify every aircraft Lockheed produced by the sound of its engine. By 18, he had dropped out of school to become a line mechanic, learning to service, repair, and rebuild aircraft with his hands rather than from textbooks. He was not an engineer. He had no college degree. What he had was something rarer and more valuable. An intuitive understanding of how machines actually behaved under stress, as opposed to how they were supposed to behave in theory. When the P-38 Lightning arrived at his maintenance depot in England in August 1943, Garrett spent 3 consecutive nights reading every technical manual, every service bulletin, every modification order that came with it. The other mechanics thought he was crazy. The pilots thought he was eager in an annoying way. His commanding officer told him to get some sleep and stop obsessing. Garrett ignored all of them, because what he was reading in those manuals described something that should not have been possible. The P-38 was the brainchild of a 33-year-old Lockheed engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, and the story of how it came to exist begins with a specification that every other American aviation company looked at and immediately rejected. In June 1937, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X-608, a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, hitting 400 miles per hour, carrying heavy armament, and maintaining enough range for extended operations. Company after company examined the requirements and reached the same conclusion. Impossible. You cannot have high speed and heavy armament and long range and high altitude performance in a single airframe. Physics will not allow it. Pick 2, maybe 3, not all 4. Kelly Johnson did not pick 2. Kelly Johnson looked at the requirements and asked a question nobody else thought to ask: what if we used 2 engines? Not because twin-engine fighters were considered superior. The conventional wisdom of 1937 said exactly the opposite. Twin-engine aircraft were heavier, less maneuverable, more expensive, harder to maintain. They were for bombers and reconnaissance platforms, not frontline fighters. But Johnson was not trying to optimize an existing fighter philosophy. He was trying to solve a specific problem, and 2 engines solved it in a way 1 engine never could. 2 Allison V1 710 engines produced a combined 2,600 horsepower. Later variants would push that to 3,200, double the power of any single-engine fighter alive. With the engines mounted in separate booms, the central fuselage pod became entirely available for fuel pilot and armament. 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, firing in perfectly parallel paths with no convergence issues. And critically, each engine got its own General Electric turbocharger, a device that uses exhaust gases to force air into the engine at sea-level pressure, regardless of actual altitude. This is where Thomas Garrett's obsession begins to make sense. Because the turbocharger is the secret weapon that nobody in the Luftwaffe fully understood, a conventional supercharger, the kind used in every Bf-109 variant, is gear-driven. It draws power from the engine itself to boost air pressure, and it loses effectiveness as altitude increases because the air gets thinner and the mechanical limitations of the system become insurmountable. At 30,000 feet, a BF-109's engine is producing maybe 1,000 horsepower, 30% less than at sea level. The pilot feels it in every control input. The aircraft becomes sluggish, unresponsive, a ghost of itself. The P-38's turbocharger draws on exhaust gases energy that would otherwise be wasted and uses it to compress incoming air to sea-level density. Each engine breathes as easily at 30,000 feet as it does on the ground. Full power, full climb rate, full acceleration. While the BF-109 is gasping, the P-38 is screaming. Garrett understood this the moment he finished the third technical manual at 3 a.m. on his second sleepless night. He walked outside into the cold English darkness, looked up at the sky, and thought about what it would mean for a German pilot to meet this aircraft for the first time. To know with absolute certainty, built on 4 years of combat experience, that you had the altitude advantage. That the twin-engine American below you was heavy, slow, degraded by thin air, easy prey for a disciplined diving attack. And then to watch it climb through you. The first real test came 3 days later. First Lieutenant Virgil Smith of the 55th Fighter Group was leading a 4-ship P-38 flight, escorting a bomber formation over Schweinfurt, when German radar controllers vectored a staffel of BF-109G6 to intercept. The German flight leader, a veteran with 14 kills and 174 combat missions, had perfect position. Sun at his back. 3,000 feet of altitude advantage. Textbook. He rolled into his diving attack at 400 miles per hour, absolutely certain of the outcome. Smith saw him coming, and instead of breaking formation, instead of diving away to build speed and run, Smith did something the German pilot's brain literally could not process as a rational tactical decision. He pushed both throttles to war emergency power, 3,200 combined horsepower, and pulled the nose vertical. At 24,000 feet. Climbing. Not struggling. Not wallowing. Climbing at 3,300 feet per minute, as though altitude and gravity were suggestions rather than laws. In 40 seconds, Smith's altitude advantage erased everything the German had spent the last 3 minutes building. In 60 seconds, Smith was above him, rolling inverted, converting that impossible climb into a diving attack with all the accumulated energy that the BF-109 pilot had believed belonged exclusively to him. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. The German never got a clean firing solution. Every time he maneuvered into position, the P-38 either outclimbed him to reset the geometry or outsped him in level flight. Finally, low on fuel, low on ammunition, and profoundly shaken by something that violated every rule he had been taught about air combat, the German dove away and headed home. That evening at his unit's debriefing, he tried to explain what had happened. The intelligence officer took notes with visible skepticism. Twin-engine fighters do not outclimb BF-109s at altitude. This was known. This was physics. Except it wasn't anymore. Across the Luftwaffe, after-action reports were beginning to pile up. Different units, different fronts, different pilots with hundreds of hours of combined combat experience, all of them reporting the same impossible thing. The American twin-engine fighter maintains climb performance at altitudes where our aircraft lose effectiveness. Standard altitude tactics are ineffective. The rules have changed, and in a maintenance hangar outside London, Thomas Garrett was already on his back under a P-38 torque wrench in hand, making sure the turbocharger seals on engine number 2 were within spec for the next morning's mission. He had not slept in 40 hours. He did not care, because he knew something the German pilots were only beginning to understand. This was not just a better airplane. This was a different kind of airplane, built on different assumptions, solving a different problem. And the pilots who would fly it into combat over Germany in the coming months were about to rewrite every rule about what a fighter could do at the edge of the atmosphere. But there was one problem nobody had solved yet, one critical vulnerability in the P-38 that German engineers had already identified from captured intelligence, a flaw so dangerous that American test pilots had already died because of it, A weakness that, if the Luftwaffe could exploit it, might make everything Virgil Smith accomplished over Schweinfurt completely irrelevant. In Part 2, we go inside the secret program to fix that flaw, the race against time that played out in wind tunnels and test hangars while real pilots were dying over Germany. And the moment one American engineer made a decision so counterintuitive that his own colleagues tried to have him removed from the project. The answer, when it came, would save thousands of lives. But first, it almost killed everyone involved. In Part 1, we watched Franz Stigler dive at full speed toward a P-38 Lightning over Schweinfurt and have the laws of physics rewritten in front of his eyes. We watched Virgil Smith pull his aircraft nearly vertical at 24,000 feet and climb through a textbook German diving attack as though altitude and gravity were merely suggestions. We watched the first after-action reports pile up across Luftwaffe units, experienced pilots with hundreds of combat hours struggling to describe something their training had told them was impossible. And we ended with one question hanging in the cold English air. What was the critical vulnerability in the P-38 that German engineers had already identified the flaw so dangerous that American test pilots had already died because of it? Here is the number that answers that question. 11. American test pilots killed or seriously injured attempting to recover from high-speed dives in the P-38 before the war even began. Not in combat, not over enemy territory. In controlled test environments with experienced pilots with ground crews standing by. 11 men discovered the same terrifying truth above 400 miles per hour in a dive the P-38's controls locked. Completely. The aircraft entered what engineers called compressibility transonic airflow over the wing, created shock waves that made the elevators physically immovable. The nose tucked further down. The dive steepened. The ground came up fast. And there was nothing the pilot could do about it. The Germans knew. Captured intelligence reconnaissance photographs of crashed P-38s, technical analysis of the airframe, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. Force a P-38 into a high-speed dive, and you had a reasonable chance of killing the pilot without firing a single shot. This was not a minor engineering problem. This was an existential flaw in the aircraft's design, and in the summer of 1943, it remained unsolved. That is where Thomas Garrett comes back into this story. Garrett had read every technical bulletin that accompanied the P-38S to England. He had spent 3 sleepless nights doing it. And buried in Service Bulletin 115-12, marked as pending review and not yet approved for field implementation, was a proposed solution from a Lockheed engineer named Ward Beeman. Hydraulically boosted dive flaps, small surfaces mounted on the underside of the wing, that when deployed at speed would change the pressure distribution across the airfoil and break the compressibility effect before it locked the controls. The math said it would work. Wind tunnel data said it would work. But the Army Air Force's technical office in London had not approved the modification for combat aircraft because the full flight test program had not been completed back in Burbank. Garrett walked into his commanding officer's office on a Tuesday morning with the service bulletin in his hand and made the case for installing the experimental dive flaps on the P-38 LS already in England. Major Richard Hollis looked at the document, looked at Garrett and said, "You're a crew chief sergeant, not an engineer." "The math is in the bulletin, sir." Beeman ran the numbers. "The wind tunnel data confirms it." "The modification is not approved." "Pilots are dying, sir." "The modification is not approved." Hollis closed the folder and set it on his desk with a finality that was meant to end the conversation. We follow the technical order process. That exists for a reason. If you install unapproved modifications on combat aircraft and something goes wrong, we lose the aircraft, we lose the pilot, and we lose the entire P-38 program in this theater. Is that what you want? Garrett left the office. He did not stop. The man he found was not a general, not a politician. He was a 41-year-old colonel named Benjamin Kelsey. The same Benjamin Kelsey who had flown the XP-38 prototype on its first flight in January 1939. The same man who had belly landed it on a golf course in Ohio after the fuel management failure that destroyed it. Kelsey knew the P-38's capabilities better than anyone alive. He also knew its flaws better than anyone alive. He had been flying with them, around them, and in spite of them for 4 years. Garrett found him on the flight line watching a P-38 taxi out for a morning mission. He had 90 seconds to make his case before Kelsey walked away. "Colonel, Sergeant Thomas Garrett, 55th Maintenance. I need 60 seconds on Service Bulletin 1-15-12. Kelsey stopped walking. "Beeman's dive flap proposal. You know it. I helped write the original requirement." Kelsey turned to look at him fully for the first time. "What's your question? Why isn't it installed on these aircraft? Because the flight test program isn't complete. How many more pilots do we lose while it gets completed?" There was a long pause. A P-38 engine roared somewhere behind them. Kelsey looked at the service bulletin Garrett was holding. Then he said, "Come to my office at 1600. Bring every piece of paper you have." What Kelsey proposed was technically within his authority and practically unprecedented. A field modification trial, 4 P-38s from the 55th Fighter Group would receive the dive flap installation using components fabricated by Garrett's maintenance team based on Beeman's specifications. Those 4 aircraft would fly a controlled evaluation under Kelsey's direct supervision. If the modification performed as predicted, Kelsey would use his authority as senior P-38 program officer in the European theater to approve emergency field implementation across all available aircraft, pending formal completion of the Burbank test program. If it failed, Garrett would face a court-martial for performing unauthorized modifications on combat aircraft. 1 chance, 4 aircraft. And Hollis, when he found out, was furious enough to make Garrett's hands shake writing up the paperwork. The morning of the test was October 3, 1943. Cold, overcast visibility acceptable. Kelsey had invited 3 other senior officers to observe, including one from the 8th Air Force Bomber Command, who had a very personal interest in anything that might keep his escorts alive longer. Garrett and his team had worked for 36 consecutive hours installing the dive flaps. The fabrication was clean. The hydraulic lines pressure tested to spec. He had checked every connection personally twice. The first pilot to test the modified aircraft was Captain James Herron, a former aerobatics instructor with 800 hours of flight time. His mission was straightforward: climb to 30,000 feet push into a full-power dive, accelerate past 400 miles per hour, and attempt recovery using the dive flaps. He climbed. The officers on the ground watched through binoculars. The aircraft became a silver dot against gray cloud, then disappeared entirely. 4 minutes and 20 seconds of silence. Then Hollis said quietly to no one in particular, "If that aircraft doesn't come back, Garrett goes to Leavenworth." The P-38 appeared below the cloud base at 12,000 feet, wings level, pulling smoothly out of a dive at an angle that should have been unrecoverable. Herron brought it around and made a low pass over the field at 500 feet, waggling his wings. Then he climbed away and did it again. And again. On his 3rd dive, ground observers with instruments recorded the aircraft reaching 430 miles per hour in the dive, well past the threshold where previous P-38s had experienced unrecoverable compressibility and pulling out in under 4 seconds with full pilot authority throughout. When Herron landed and climbed out of the cockpit, he stood on the wing for a moment before climbing down, which was not something fighter pilots typically did. He was composing himself. "Controls stayed responsive the entire time," he said. "I had full authority at 4:30. I could have gone deeper." The senior bomber command officer turned to Kelsey. "How fast can you get this on every P-38 in England?" Kelsey looked at Garrett. "How fast can you train other maintenance teams?" The answer was not fast enough, and not without a fight, because the logistics of field modifying every P-38 in the European theater required fabricating components without a formal supply chain, training maintenance crews who had never heard of the modification, and convincing unit commanders who resented being told by a sergeant and a colonel that their aircraft needed emergency work before the next mission. Some refused outright. One group commander told Garrett directly that he was not letting some wrench monkey experiment on my aircraft based on a memo. Garrett spent 2 weeks moving between bases, sleeping in maintenance hangars, demonstrating the fabrication process, personally walking crew chiefs through the installation step by step. He carried Kelsey's authorization letter in his left breast pocket. He carried Beeman's original service bulletin in his right. He showed pilots the math. He showed them Heron's test data. Some needed the math. Most needed to hear it from Heron himself, who had begun making informal visits to units where the modification was encountering resistance, standing in briefing rooms in his flight suit and saying simply, "I put the aircraft into a dive. I would not have survived 6 weeks ago. I flew home. Install the flaps." By late October 1943, 67 P-38s in the European theater had received the dive flap modification. The results in combat were immediate. Pilots who had previously avoided high-speed dives against Bf-109s, knowing that the Germans' superior dive performance was partly a product of the P-38's compressibility problem, now had full authority at any speed the aircraft could reach. The psychological shift was as significant as the technical one. They were no longer managing a flaw. They were flying the aircraft it was always supposed to be. German pilots began reporting a change in P-38 behavior in November 1943, after action summaries noted that American twin-engine fighters were no longer breaking off diving attacks prematurely, that they were following through at speeds previously associated with uncontrolled dives, that the tactical assumption of forcing P-38s into high-speed dives to exploit compressibility, an assumption quietly built into Luftwaffe engagement doctrine since mid-1943, was no longer producing results. But the Luftwaffe's response to that discovery was not to accept defeat. It was to send a message to Berlin requesting intelligence on what the Americans had changed. And within 3 weeks of that request, a German technical intelligence officer in occupied France had obtained through a source inside a British logistics depot a copy of Service Bulletin 115-12 and a partial fabrication schematic for the dive flap assembly. They now knew exactly what had changed. And they had begun working on a counter. In Part 3, we follow that intelligence report to a Messerschmitt development facility outside Munich, where a team of engineers would spend 60 days trying to find a way to make the Bf-109's mechanical supercharger match what a turbocharger could do, and where one German test pilot would take an aircraft into conditions it was never designed to survive because the alternative was losing the war from the sky down. The countermove was bold, it was desperate, and it very nearly worked. In Part 1, a German ace dove at a P-38 over Schweinfurt and watched physics stop working. In Part 2, a mechanic named Thomas Garrett pushed an unauthorized modification through bureaucratic resistance, and a near court-martial installed experimental dive flaps on 4 aircraft and proved in a single terrifying test dive that the P-38's most dangerous flaw could be fixed with fabricated components and 36 hours of sleepless work. By late October 1943, 67 modified P-38s were flying combat missions over Germany. The compressibility problem was solved. The Luftwaffe had obtained a copy of Service Bulletin 115-12 and started working on a counter. And now, this was no longer a test program. This was a war. The German Technical Intelligence Report reached Oberkommando der Luftwaffe in Berlin on November 4, 1943. The officer who wrote it was not dramatic by nature, but even he could not keep the alarm out of his language. The Americans had eliminated the primary exploitable vulnerability in the P-38 airframe. Dive-forcing tactics, which had produced confirmed kills or mission aborts in an estimated 23% of P-38 engagements during the previous 4 months, could no longer be relied upon. The report recommended immediate priority development of high-altitude performance improvements for frontline BF-109 variants, specifically addressing the mechanical supercharger's degradation curve above 25,000 feet. General Adolf Galland, commanding the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, read the report twice. Then he convened an emergency meeting at his headquarters and said something that would have been unthinkable. 18 months earlier, the P-38 had to be treated as a superior aircraft in its operational envelope, and German pilots needed to stop engaging it on its terms. The statistics behind that admission were brutal. In October 1943, the month Garrett's modified aircraft began flying Luftwaffe fighter units, reported 34 confirmed losses in engagements, specifically involving P-38 escorts. In September, before the modification, that number had been 19. The increase was not entirely attributable to the dive flaps. More P-38s were flying. American pilot experience was accumulating, escort tactics were improving, but German intelligence analysis correctly identified that the modified aircraft was behaving differently in combat, more aggressive in the dive, less likely to disengage under pressure. The BF-109's one reliable mechanical advantage over the P-38, the ability to force a compressibility dive and walk away, had been neutralized. The counter-program at Messerschmitt's facility outside Munich was given a designation and a deadline 60 days to produce a demonstrable improvement in high-altitude performance for the BF-109 G14 variant. The lead engineer, a man named Heinrich Beauvais, understood the fundamental problem immediately. You cannot make a mechanical supercharger perform like a turbocharger by optimizing the mechanical supercharger. The thermodynamics are different, the physics are different. You would need to redesign the engine from the intake manifold to the exhaust, and you have 60 days and a war happening outside your window. Beauvais tried anyway. His team worked through November on boost pressure modifications, intercooler improvements, revised timing curves. They gained approximately 80 horsepower at 28,000 feet, meaningful on paper, irrelevant against the P-38's 400 horsepower advantage at that altitude. The test pilot who flew the modified G14 in December wrote in his evaluation, "Improvement noted, insufficient." He had the tact of a man who understood that writing, "This will not save us," in an official document was a career-ending decision. Back in England, Garrett was facing a different kind of problem. Success had created demand that his maintenance teams could not meet. The modification program had expanded from 67 aircraft to a projected 180 spread across 4 fighter groups, using field-fabricated components, because the formal supply chain for approved dive flap kits from Burbank had not yet been established. 3 installations had developed hydraulic leaks during the first week of combat operations. 1 aircraft had returned from a mission with a dive flap partially deployed, creating asymmetric drag that the pilot barely controlled home. Nobody was hurt. But Hollis, who had never stopped looking for a reason to shut the program down, now had ammunition. 3 leaks and a near crash in the first week, Hollis said. You want to tell me this is a success story? Garrett looked at the maintenance logs spread across the table between them. The leaks came from one batch of hydraulic fittings from a supplier I flagged before installation. I asked for replacement stock. I was told to use what was available. And the asymmetric deployment. Pilot inadvertently activated the system during a turning engagement. It's a crew training issue, not a design issue. I have a revised procedure ready. Or, Hollis said, it is a design issue, and we have installed an experimental modification on 67 combat aircraft based on the word of a sergeant and 1 successful test flight. Garrett said nothing for a moment. Then, ask Heron. Kelsey intervened before the argument went further, but the pressure was real and the timeline was compressing. 8th Air Force Headquarters wanted the modification completed across all available P-38s before the winter deep penetration missions began. Berlin was on the target list. Escort fighters would be operating at maximum range, maximum altitude, maximum duration. If the dive flaps failed at critical moments, the consequences would be measured in bomber crews. Then on December 11, 1943, the question stopped being theoretical. The mission was the first American daylight bombing raid on Emden, Germany, escorted by P-38s from the 55th Fighter Group, flying the full modified complement. Garrett had personally supervised the final installation checks on 12 of the 24 escort aircraft the night before. He had not slept. He watched them take off in the gray English morning, and then spent 6 hours doing the only thing available to a ground crew chief during a combat mission: waiting. The bomber formation crossed the Dutch coast at 27,000 feet. 3 Jagdgeschwader units, approximately 80 Bf-109s and FW-190s, had been vectored to intercept. The German controllers watching the formation on radar saw the twin-boomed escort silhouettes and transmitted the updated tactical instruction dive force, the P-38s. Standard procedure. Proven effective. 40 seconds later, the standard procedure stopped working. Captain Robert Millikan, leading the high escort flight, saw the first German bounce coming from above and to the right. 8 Bf-109 Sun at their backs, diving fast. His flight of 4 had been at 29,000 feet. The Germans were at 32,000. Perfect position. Exactly what doctrine prescribed. Millikan called the brake and pushed both throttles to war emergency power. The P-38's nose came up. Not a gradual defensive climb. Near vertical. The turbocharged Allisons at 29,000 feet did not notice the altitude. They delivered full power. All of it. The Bf-109s dove through the space. The P-38S had occupied 15 seconds earlier and found nothing but thin air. The lead German pilot pulled out of his dive, looked up, and saw 4 P-38s above him. Climbing. Still climbing. What followed was 6 minutes of the most one-sided high-altitude combat the 55th Fighter Group had yet experienced. Millikan's flight shot down 3 Bf-109s in the first 2 minutes, all from diving attacks initiated from altitude the Germans had thought was theirs. A second P-38 flight, seeing the engagement, broke from bomber escort and engaged a separate formation of FW-190s, attempting to circle around to the bomber's rear. The FW-190s, designed for lower and medium altitude performance, were at 28,000 feet and sluggish. 2 were destroyed. 2 more disengaged and dove away. The bombers reached Emden. They bombed. They turned for home. Of the 27 B-17s on the mission, none were lost. Not one. Previous comparable missions without P-38 escort at depth had suffered average losses of 8 to 12%. The German units that intercepted reported losing 7 fighters, confirmed destroyed 4 more damaged, and force landed with no confirmed bomber kills. It was, in the sterile language of after-action reports, a mission success. In the less sterile language of the bomber crews who walked back to their barracks that evening still alive, it was something else entirely. One navigator, a 22-year-old from Ohio named Carl Desmond, wrote in his personal diary that night, "Saw the P-38s above us the whole way in. Watched them go up after the 109s like they owned the sky. They came home. We came home. I didn't think that was possible anymore." The Emden mission was not the largest air battle of 1943. It was not the most strategically significant target. But it was the first deep-penetration daylight mission since the October Schweinfurt disaster to return with 0 bomber losses, and it happened because modified P-38s with functional dive flaps could outclimb every German fighter at the altitude where German fighters had previously been untouchable. Word traveled fast. Within 48 hours, every fighter group in the 8th Air Force knew the details. Within a week, requests for the modification had come in from 3 additional units. Bomber loss rates on escorted deep missions dropped from above 10% in October 1943 to 4.2% in December. That is not a statistic. That is hundreds of men who flew home instead of falling. The Luftwaffe began issuing revised tactical instructions in January 1944, acknowledging for the first time in writing that P-38 escorts could not be reliably neutralized by altitude tactics, and that engagement should be avoided unless numerical superiority exceeded 3 to 1, The most experienced fighter force in the world was issuing defensive instructions about an aircraft they had dismissed as a heavy reconnaissance platform 18 months earlier. Garrett received a letter of commendation from Colonel Kelsey in February 1944. Hollis signed it without comment. The formal approval of the dive flap modification for all P-38 variants arrived from Burbank the same week, 6 months after Garrett had installed it in a field hangar on 4 aircraft with fabricated parts and a borrowed torque wrench. But here is what the commendation letter did not say, and what the official records do not fully capture. The man who had pushed the modification through, who had spent 2 weeks sleeping in maintenance hangars, arguing with group commanders who had built the case from a service bulletin nobody had read, was already looking at the next problem. Because the P-38 was dominant in late 1943 and early 1944, but the Germans were not finished. The Me-262 jet program had just received emergency priority status from Hitler's headquarters. And a new generation of Luftwaffe pilots, younger, more desperate, less bound by the tactical doctrine that had failed their predecessors, were developing engagement methods specifically designed to exploit the one remaining vulnerability in the modified P-38 that Garrett had not yet solved. In Part 4, we follow what happens to the men who built and flew this aircraft when the war ends, what Kelly Johnson built next with everything the P-38 taught him, and why the lessons learned in a maintenance hangar in England in October 1943 are still shaping how fighter aircraft are designed and flown today. The final chapter of this story is about legacy, and the most important part of it has never been told in a documentary before. From a mechanic's hands in a Burbank factory floor to the skies over Germany, this story traveled further than anyone who lived it could have imagined. In Part 1, we watched Franz Stigler dive at a P-38 and lose his understanding of physics. In Part 2, Thomas Garrett pushed an unauthorized modification through bureaucracy and one terrifying test dive to fix the aircraft's most dangerous flaw. In Part 3, modified P-38s over Emden proved that American bombers could survive deep penetration missions, and the Luftwaffe began issuing defensive instructions about an aircraft they had once dismissed. But there is one question this story has not yet answered. What happened to the men behind it? And the answer, it turns out, is the most surprising part of all. Because success in wartime is not always what you imagine it will be. And sometimes the people who change history are the last ones to understand what they have done. Thomas Garrett was promoted to Master Sergeant in January 1944, 2 months after the Emden mission. The promotion came with a letter of commendation, a handshake from Colonel Kelsey, and reassignment to a new role overseeing P-38 maintenance training across 4 fighter groups in England. It was on paper a recognition of everything he had accomplished. In practice, it meant Garrett spent the remaining 18 months of the war in briefing rooms rather than hangars, teaching other crew chiefs the modification procedures he had developed under pressure in October 1943. He was good at it. He was patient, thorough, and precise in the way that only people who have learned by touching machines, rather than reading about them, can be. But he missed the work. He missed the specific solvable problem of an aircraft that needed to fly tomorrow, and a part that did not fit the way the manual said it should. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Garrett was 27 years old. He returned to Burbank on a troop ship in August. Lockheed offered him a position on the production floor, which he accepted. He worked there for 31 years. He never held an engineering title. He never received a patent. The dive flap modification he had pushed through in a field hangar based on someone else's service bulletin was formally credited in Army Air Force's records to Ward Beeman, the Lockheed engineer who had written the original proposal. Garrett's name appears in the Emden Mission After Action report as maintenance supervisor in Colonel Kelsey's personal diary as the sergeant who actually made it work, and nowhere else in the official historical record. Major Richard Hollis, who had threatened Garrett with a court-martial over the unauthorized installation, retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1952. Captain James Herron, who had climbed to 30,000 feet and proved the flaps worked in that first terrifying test dive, became a commercial airline pilot and flew for TWA for 22 years. He told the story of that test flight at aviation industry events for the rest of his life, always ending the same way. "I didn't know if I was coming back." Garrett knew. He was the only one. Franz Stigler, the German ace from our opening scene, survived the war with 28 confirmed kills. He immigrated to Canada in 1953 and spent his career as an aerospace engineer, working on aircraft systems with a precision and attention to detail that his former opponents, had they known, might have recognized as characteristically Luftwaffe. He gave interviews in his 70s about the air war over Germany, with the measured honesty of a man who had processed his experience over many decades. He said he did not hate the pilots who flew against him. He said he respected the P-38 more than any aircraft he had encountered, and he said when asked what losing the air war had felt like from inside it, that it had felt less like being defeated and more like discovering that the rules he had lived by were written in pencil rather than stone. The dive flap modification that Garrett installed on 67 aircraft in October 1943 became standard equipment on all P-38 variants from the J-25 block onward. Over 5,000 aircraft received it in production or field installation before the war ended. The engineering principle it embodied, using small aerodynamic surfaces to actively manage compressibility effects during high-speed maneuvering, did not disappear with the P-38. It evolved. Post-war aeronautical engineers studying the P-38's performance data used the compressibility research accumulated during its development to inform the design of transonic and supersonic aircraft. The airflow characteristics that had killed 11 American test pilots before Beeman and Garrett solved the problem became foundational data for understanding how aircraft behave at the edge of the sound barrier. When Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 on October 14, 1947, the flight control systems that kept his aircraft stable drew on research that the P-38 program had made unavoidable. The dead ends and the solutions both mattered. The turbocharger technology refined in the P-38 extended further than anyone expected. General Electric's Aviation Turbocharger Division, which had produced the Type B-13 units, installed in the P-38's tail booms, became the foundation of GE's post-war gas turbine engine program. The engineers who spent the war solving overheating and control problems in P-38 turbochargers were the same engineers who designed the J-35 and J-47 jet engines that powered America's first generation of post-war combat aircraft. The F-86 Sabre, which established American air superiority over Soviet MiG-15s in Korea between 1950 and 1953, flew on engines whose lineage traced directly back to the turbocharger lessons learned above Germany in 1943. The chain of inheritance is direct and documentable. Every technological generation learns from the one before it, but rarely do you find a line this clean and this consequential. In commercial aviation, the turbocharging principles developed for the P-38 influenced the development of pressurized aircraft that made long-range passenger flight economically viable after the war. The ability to maintain engine power at high altitude, the same capability that had allowed Virgil Smith to outclimb Franz Stigler over Schweinfurt, translated into the ability to cruise at altitudes where air resistance was lower and fuel consumption was reduced. Modern turbofan engines are engineering generations removed from the GEB-13 units in the P-38's tail booms, but the fundamental principle using exhaust energy to maintain intake pressure at altitude is unchanged. The P-38 did not invent the turbocharger. It proved in the most consequential possible testing environment that the technology could work reliably under extreme conditions. That proof changed what engineers believed was worth attempting next. The largest lesson this story carries is not technical, it is institutional. Kelly Johnson's P-38 was built because a 33-year-old engineer was allowed to question a specification that every other company had declared impossible. Thomas Garrett's modification was implemented because a colonel with enough authority and enough personal history with the aircraft was willing to stake his reputation on the word of a sergeant who had read every technical bulletin 3 times and understood something that the approval process had not yet caught up to. Both of these things required an organization willing to be wrong about who had the right answer. That is a rarer capability than it sounds. Most institutions, military or civilian, are optimized to prevent unauthorized action. The logic is sound. Unauthorized action in a maintenance hangar can kill people. The cost is that the person most likely to see a solution is often the person with the least authority to implement it. The 8th Air Force in 1943 got lucky. The right people created enough space for the right idea at the right moment. History turns on those moments more than we like to admit. The Luftwaffe's failure to adapt to the P-38 is the mirror image of this lesson. The organization was not incompetent. Its engineers were skilled. Its pilots were among the most experienced in the world. But it was structured around assumptions that had been validated by 4 years of combat success, and that success made the assumptions feel like laws rather than conclusions. When Beauvais and his team at Messerschmitt spent 60 days trying to make a mechanical supercharger perform like a turbocharger, they were not failing due to lack of effort or intelligence. They were failing because the institutional decision to develop a different solution had never been seriously made. Germany had the engineering talent. It did not have the organizational flexibility, the resource availability, or the freedom from existing doctrine to pursue a different path once the existing path proved insufficient. The P-38 won in part because America had more room to fail. Now here is the detail that most accounts of this story miss entirely, and it requires going back to a document that sat in Army Air Force's archives for decades before researchers paid close attention to it. In February 1944, 3 months after the Emden mission and the formal adoption of Garrett's modification, a Luftwaffe technical intelligence team in France submitted a second report to Berlin. This one went further than the first. Based on interrogation of a downed American pilot and analysis of components recovered from a P-38 crash site in the Netherlands, German engineers had correctly identified not just what the dive flap modification did, but how it had been fabricated. The components were not factory standard. They were hand-machined to specifications that differed in measurable ways from what a formal production run would have produced. The report noted with a precision that is almost admirable in retrospect that the American field modification was structurally adequate, but dimensionally inconsistent, suggesting it had been produced by skilled technicians, working from engineering drawings, rather than by automated manufacturing processes. What the German analysts concluded from this was that the Americans had a serious supply chain problem and were improvising solutions at the unit level out of necessity. They recommended this as an intelligence finding of potential significance. American maintenance infrastructure might be under greater strain than previously assessed. They were looking directly at evidence of Thomas Garrett's unauthorized, under-resourced 36 consecutive hour fabrication job, and they interpreted it as American weakness. It was in fact the opposite. The inconsistent dimensions were not evidence of supply chain failure. They were evidence that one man had understood the problem well enough to solve it with what he had faster than the formal system could respond. The Germans saw improvisation and diagnosed desperation. What they were actually looking at was adaptability. By the time that second report reached Berlin, the modification had been approved by Lockheed, standardized in production, and installed on aircraft across 4 fighter groups. The German assessment was already obsolete. The war had moved on without waiting for the paperwork. Garrett learned about that German intelligence report in 1987, when a researcher writing a history of P-38 operations showed him a translated copy. He was 69 years old, retired from Lockheed, living in the same part of California where he had grown up 2 miles from the factory. He read it carefully the way he had always read technical documents, and then he set it down and was quiet for a moment. The researcher asked what he was thinking. Garrett said, "They thought we were struggling. We were just in a hurry." From a line mechanic in Burbank with grease on his hands and a service bulletin, nobody had read to a modification that flew on over 5,000 aircraft and contributed to bomber loss rates dropping from 20% to below 4%. Thomas Garrett's story is not in the textbooks. It is in the after-action reports and the personal diaries and the archived technical documents of a war that produced thousands of innovations by thousands of people whose names history did not keep. That is why it is worth telling. Not because it is exceptional, but because it is representative. For every Kelly Johnson who became famous, there were 10 Thomas Garretts who made the famous person's idea actually work. For every Virgil Smith who flew the mission, there was a crew chief who spent the night before it on his back under the aircraft, making sure it would come home. The P-38 destroyed more than 1,800 German aircraft in the European theater. It escorted bombers to Berlin and back. It broke the Luftwaffe's psychological confidence in its own invincibility. And it did all of that because someone who was told he was just a wrench monkey read the manual more carefully than anyone else and refused to accept that the right answer had to wait for the right authorization. If you know a story like this one, a forgotten innovator, an unauthorized solution, a small decision that changed something large, put it in the comments. These are the histories that matter most, and most of them are still waiting to be found. Subscribe and stay with us, because there are hundreds more where this came from. Every war, every crisis, every moment of genuine change in human history has a Thomas Garrett somewhere in it. Someone in a position that did not come with authority, solving a problem that the people with authority had decided was unsolvable. The only question that matters is whether anyone was paying attention. Tonight for 90 minutes you were.